Our speaker today remembers really, really well. I first laid eyes on this man on a television screen 6 or 7 years ago, and I fell in love with him at that point, and I said, I need to meet him, and he needs to visit us in Boring. And so I asked our mutual friend, Jerry Boykin, to introduce me. Had the pleasure of meeting Admiral William Dean Lee at that point. But when I laid my eyes on him on the television, there he was speaking in the National Day of Prayer before a distinguished audience, wearing his Coast Guard dress whites with 2 Admiral stars on his shoulder. And he said some very strong things. He said, I left my notes on my chair. I want to speak from my heart. That was a time when the Bible was being pushed out of the military. We don't want it on any desks. You may remember a young Air Force woman was being pressured to keep her Bible off of her desk because it had no place in government circles. And our Admiral decided it was time for him to make a statement. So he said words to this effect. This is what I remember. I'm sure it's not a direct quote, Dean, but this is what I remember because I was watching closely. He held up a book. Said something like, this is my Bible. Nobody tells me where to put it, keep it, or hide it. And then he went on for a dozen minutes to inspire my soul to be what God wants me to be in his army in the day in which we live. So Good Shepherd has her general, General Boykin. Now she has her Admiral, Admiral Lee. Would you welcome him to this podium with a Good Shepherd welcome?
Thank you. Please have a seat. So, the last 48 hours have been 2 days that I'll never forget. I'm a fisherman. I live on the coast of North Carolina, a little place, Atlantic Beach. I've been fishing all my life in the waters off of Virginia and North Carolina, and I've caught a lot of fish. Some of them big fish. But yesterday, and some of them fish, I got to go 40, 50, 60 miles offshore to catch, burn 100 gallons of gas, bring home 30 pounds of fish. Do the math. So I flew out here to Oregon, and Stu over there, he had arranged for me to go out with one of his good friends who I will now call my favorite fishing guide in all of the world. Greg Christ right here. Greg took me out on his boat yesterday, and we didn't run but 1 mile up the Columbia River. And I caught the biggest fish of my life, a 10-foot-long sturgeon. And I am some kind of sight. I love you, man. All right, if I can get this thing to work here. All right, I want to talk to you guys about, I got a particular message I want to leave you, which was inspired by my pastor in Atlantic Beach, North Carolina, who asked me a number of years ago, he said, Dean, what did you do in the Coast Guard? I said, well, I did what all Coast Guardsmen do. He said, no, but what did you really do? What was your specialty? Everybody's got a specialty. And I said, well, it was search and rescue. That was my focus. I probably was involved in more search and rescue cases by the time I retired on active duty than anybody else on active duty at that time. I'm sure that record would be bust, but I was involved in thousands of search and rescue cases in one form or another throughout my 35-and-a-half-year career. I saw some good things, some bad things, and some ugly things. And he said, you need to turn that into a message about the gospel. And so he gave me a challenge, and so I did. I put my heart to it. I got to the Bible, and I've turned that into a message that I hope to deliver to you today. And we're going to talk about searching for those that are lost and facing the storms of life and using those storms to our advantage. Before I get into any of this, though, I want to tell you this up front. I'm not a preacher. I'm not a chaplain. I'm nothing more than a sinner who used to wear a sailor suit. I'm still a sinner, just wears blue golf pants. Saved by grace. I believe that Jesus Christ was who he said he was. that he did what the Bible said he did, and that this here is the holy inspired word of God. And if I tell you anything today that runs counter to that, you hold me accountable afterwards. That's the message for you today. So we made a much ado about all of those of us who have served our country, and thank you all who stood up for your various services. There's 2 or 3 other groups, though, that I want to recognize. Everybody in here who is now or who has ever been a police officer or in law enforcement, please stand up. Thank you. Everybody who has been a firefighter or an EMS responder, please stand up. Everybody in here who is called a first responder of any sort, please stand up. Thank you for your service. You men and women put your lives on the line just as much as we did. And God bless you. Now, there's many of you in this audience that I know didn't have the opportunity to serve in uniform. But I'm here to tell you that you are serving. You are in the army of God if you're a Christian, which is a much higher calling than any of those callings that any of the rest of us who are being honored here today. And unlike all the rest of us who had tours of duty that ended after 20 years or 30 years, when you're in the army of God, your tour never ends. We serve till we take our last breath. And there's an enemy out there who is trying always to come after us. And I want to talk about that enemy, and I want to talk about how we turn and we face that enemy today. So today I want to talk to you about, obviously, God. I want to talk about our duty to God and standing your ground. I'm rescuing the lost, and I'm going to push you before it is all over into your zones of discomfort. Because that's what you do when you sign up to serve the people, when you sign up to serve Jesus Christ. And I'm going to warn you, this is not going to be 35 minutes. It's going to be a little longer. So strap in and bear with me. First off, let's say happy birthday, USA. God bless America. All right, God bless America. We'll be 243 years old next week. 243 years old. Now, y'all all know what our founding fathers built this nation upon, and they were great men and women in days. But if you went to any college in the United States today, just pick one and waited outside one of the big buildings when classes were changing out, and you just started randomly polling some of those young men and women and ask them a simple question, say, hey, what is our nation's motto? Can you tell me the nation's motto? And they look at you, and some of them probably go, well, yeah, be all you can be. Just do it. Eat more chicken. Maybe one or two of them would get it right. Maybe some of you do. Maybe some of you don't know it. But our nation's motto is, in God we trust. In God we trust. We handle it every day. It's on all our coinage, all our money. But do we? Do we really trust God? Do we really believe this? Do we really live this? I'm here to tell you that our own national motto is under attack. It has now become politically incorrect. If you don't believe it, somewhere in here there's a teacher or there's a principal in some public school somewhere. I want you to imagine what would happen if the local principal in the local high school went in and got on the PA system one morning and says, hey, listen up, kids. Today we're going to trust God. You got it? Today we are going to trust in God. Go home and tell your parents. Oh man, I'm going to tell you what, the next morning, depending on what city you're in, I'm pretty sure the phone's going to be lighting up in that front office. And somebody's going to hold you accountable for bringing that God thing into the public square. Isn't that a shame that we have been walled off, so to speak, from our own national motto? There's another word up there on that coin that I want to draw your attention to. That word right there, liberty, is being stripped away from us while we're watching it and letting it happen. As those watchdog groups and those people out there who want to remove God from the public square continually put pressure on us, and we allow them to win because we are the silent Christian majority that allows that small vocal minority, that tail to wag the dog. I hope to inspire you today to take a different approach to it. And you can do it in some of the most subtle of ways. Now, there's a monument that some of you may have seen in Washington, D.C. It's the tallest structure in the nation's capital. By law, they can't build anything to compete with the Washington Monument. Nothing else can ever be built taller to compete with the Washington Monument. Well, it's little known fact that on the top of that monument outside of the public eyes, where nobody can see, on the very tip top of that obelisk, facing east and skyward, are two words written in very small letters, just about 5 1/4 inches tall. They were placed there in 1884 when they put the capstone on that monument. Those two words say, Laus Deo, Latin for praise be to God. Oh, when I heard that story, I go, that is genius. I love it. It's still there, and they haven't gotten it taken off yet. It's coming. So I decided I'm going to go out. I went out and I bought me 2 big stickers. I put one each on each side of my fishing boat that I'm offshore in all the time, called Laus Deo. There I am, me and my fishing partner, and I put them on the side of the boat because it allows me to poke a little fun at the big bear. So every morning when I get up and go fishing, I'd get on the radio and I'd call this conversation to sound like this. U.S. Coast Guard Sector, North Carolina, U.S. Coast Guard, this is Laus Deo. Laus Deo, Channel 16, come in. The radio watchstander for the United States government at the same command that I was overseeing would get back on and he would go, Laus Deo, this is U.S. Coast Guard Sector, North Carolina, 16, come in, shift 22 Alpha, answer. Now we've shifted channels to another frequency. He goes, Laus Deo, this is Sector, North Carolina. How may I help you, sir? I go, just doing a radio check. How copy? Loud and clear, Laus Deo. I have just had the federal government, praise God, 6 times in a row in 1 minute. Because I can. And so can you. I want to talk about the first SAR case that I believe is in recorded history, at least in this good book of mine here. SAR case number 1. So I take you to Matthew chapter 14. And so Jesus, he's had a bad week. He has learned that his cousin, John the Baptist, has been beheaded. And he is out working with the crowds, and he's taken a boat, and the crowds are so enthralled with him, they were following him along the shoreline as he is riding a boat, and he has compassion on them, watching them follow him up the shoreline. So he comes ashore out of compassion, and he starts healing the sick and the lame and ministering to them out of love. And after the day is over, these disciples come and say, Master, you got to send them home. We don't have any food for them. He goes, just gather them up. I'll take care of this. And then we see the miracle where Jesus feeds 5,000 men. And when you add the families, the women and the children in there, it was well over 5,000. With a couple of fish and some loaves of bread. And they had stuff left over. He's tired. So he tells his disciples, his crew, his team, says, y'all get in the boat. Y'all go on the other side. I need to get some rest. They're probably wondering, well, how are you going to get there, boss? But it doesn't say that there was any questions there. They just were compliant. They got in a boat and they went to sea. And Jesus went up into the hills there to pray. He needed some respite. And so let's pick up with the scriptures here. It says, meanwhile, while Jesus is up there praying, the disciples were in trouble far away from land, for a strong wind had risen, and they were fighting heavy waves. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came towards them, walking on the water. When the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified. In their fear, they cried out, "It's a ghost!" But Jesus spoke to them at once. He said, "Don't be afraid. Take courage. I'm here." Then Peter called to him, "Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you walking on the water." "Come on." So Peter went over the side of the boat and he walked on the water towards Jesus. But when he saw that the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified and he began to sink. And he cries out, "Save me, Lord, save me." His faith was waning. Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. "You have so little faith," Jesus said. "Why did you doubt me?" Now, there are a lot of messages you could get out of this, but there's two that I want you to take away today. First off, I believe Jesus would have been a coastie. First documented SAR case. But what this tells me is Jesus knew what he was doing when he sent him into that boat. He knew there was a storm that was going to come that night, and he sent him anyway. It begs the question, why would a loving God send us into a storm? It's because a loving God, in his perfect will, knows when we need a storm. There's two kinds of storms in our lives that God uses. There are storms of correction, and there are storms of perfection. In this particular case, he sent a storm of perfection because he needed to remove any doubt whatsoever in the minds of his crew, who he was and what he was capable of doing. We have to take a look at the lessons of Jesus, and we got to use them to our own advantage. And when we see those storms, either in our own lives or in the lives of somebody else, there's a message to be learned and there's a lesson to be taught by that storm. And in my world, we used to pray for storms so that we could go out and train in them. The schoolhouse for surfman training, the United States Coast Guard, is right down here at the mouth of the Columbia River where it empties out at Cape Disappointment. We chose that spot to train our people in heavy weather surf operations because there's no other place like it in the world. When all that water coming out of the Columbia Gorge empties out in the Pacific Ocean, it builds a delta, and there's a bar out there. And those big waves coming in off the storms of the Pacific hit that shallow water, and they build up 20, 30 feet high, and they break. When there's somebody on the other side of that inlet who needs rescuing, we have got to batter through the barrier to get to them. And so we've got to be prepared to cross the bar and headed in that storm. And we send the young and men and the greenhorns out there to have that experience so they can get the confidence that I can do this. Somebody needs me to save them. If not someone else, who? The Lord says in Isaiah, send me. That's what we signed up to do. I went to that school twice, and I remember the first time I went out on that bar, I'm looking at a big wave like this, and I'm looking up at that thing, and I'm thinking, oh, Lord, what have I done? And it comes at you, and there's a moment when that boat gets hit by that wave. It's breaking over top of it. You can't see anything. And you're wondering, oh, Lord, get me out of this. And within a few seconds, you ride through it, pound out, and you come out on the other side, and then you start to build confidence. And that's how we master our craft, by using those storms to our advantage. Now, in the world that we live in, there are all kinds of barriers that we're going to have to break through as we go through our own life storms and help others through their storms. In this particular case, it's waves. But there's those barriers of fear. There's policy barriers. And then there's people who want to stop us from breaking through to save our search target. And there's methods and manners to deal with each one of them. So my message today comes out of Luke chapter 15. What man are you, having 100 sheep, if he lose one of them, doesn't leave the rest of them in the wilderness and go after that which is lost until he find it? Well, having done this thousands of times, I can tell you that when we went after a search target, sometimes we found them in time. Those are what we call the successes. You get there, you save their lives, you bring them home to their family. Everybody celebrates. There's some that we found too late. We searched for them, but we got there minutes or sometimes hours too late, but we did find them, and so we can bring closure to the family. And then there's others that we never found, despite days of searching. Those were the toughest ones to tell the family about, because you could feel the heartache as they beg and they plead, please keep searching, please get some. They need closure, and we have no body to give them. I had to deliver those kinds of messages to parents, to mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers and sons and daughters. It's the toughest thing that I ever did in my life. The never founds. So let's dive into the definition of lost. What exactly is lost? Well, there's three kinds of lost. There's those people who just don't know where they are. They're just stuck. They won't ask for directions. There's those people that just don't know where they're going. They know where they are right now, but they got no clue where they're headed to. And then there's the third group. There's those that think they know where they're going. Oh, that's a tougher group to deal with. We're surrounded by them. Every single one of us in this room are surrounded by good people, law-abiding citizens that fall into that group of people who are non-believers, who think if you ask them, hey, where do you think you're going when you die? And they go, well, I'm going to heaven. Well, how do you know you're going to heaven? Well, because I'm pretty good. I'm basically pretty good. I try hard. Andy Stanley wrote a book about that very issue, where he asked a fundamental question, and it's to be delivered. And I buy him a case at a time to hand out to those people that I run into when we get on this subject. And he lays it out in great detail. And this is one way to disciple. You can hand them the book. Say, here, just read this. I'd like to talk to you. Because Andy goes, well, how good you got to be? Will an A get you there? B? I mean, what's the minimum score you got to get into heaven? And when you start probing them a little bit, they just go, I don't know. But I'm pretty sure I'm going. How good is good enough? Well, so I went and did a little bit of research on this. And so I went to one of the world's recognized leading religious experts to find out the answer to that question. And here was the answer that I got. One of the biggest mistakes we can make is to believe there's only one way to live. There's many ways, many paths to get to what we call God. In other words, there's a lot of ways to get into heaven. There it is. It's on the internet. It's on TV. It must be true. If you love your friends, a real friend is someone who would tell you when you got spinach in your teeth, or your fly's open and you're talking in front of a group of 100 people. They'll tell you something you don't want to hear, but you need to hear. That's what real friends are. And you need to be prepared to go to your real friends and give them the truth and nothing but the truth, or else they're going to fall in the same category as our great religious expert. They're going to stay lost. Friends don't let friends become never founds. The real truth is this, because it comes out of the lips of Jesus. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me, says the Lord. I want you to notice the specificity of that, because it doesn't say that, hey, I am one path to get there. He doesn't outline any other options. I am it. Nobody enters through that gate but by me. I don't care whether you were an A, B, or C. If you don't come to me, you don't get through the gate. And our missions as Christians are to find those people and to rescue them. It's as simple as that. We have got to go after those people. If they are our friends, if they are our neighbors, with the same kind of tenacity that the U.S. military armed forces does when we lose one of our own on the battlefield. I'll give you an example. Back in 1972, one of the most massive search efforts that I've ever seen occurred in Vietnam, when a young Air Force captain named Roger Locker, on his third tour in Vietnam, on his 407th bombing mission, bombing over Hanoi, gets shot down behind enemy lines. He lands 40 miles north of Hanoi. This is as far north as any U.S. serviceman has ever been shot down. He is deep into enemy territory. For 22 days, he evades villagers down in the jungle canopy, surviving on what he was taught in survival school and how to live and eat, eating bushes and berries and grubs. And on the 22nd day, he sees sight of a U.S. airplane who was on a bombing mission, and he breaks out his radio and he calls him. U.S. aircraft 40 miles north of Hanoi, U.S. aircraft 40 miles. This is Oyster 1 Bravo, which is his call sign. Come in. The pilot of the aircraft gets the message. He receives it. He authenticates who he was. Oyster 1 Bravo then says, I've been down here 22 days. You reckon you could come pick me up? You betcha. You betcha. So then he goes radio silent. The pilot flies back, and then they notify the combat SAR team. And so they man up. They strap on helicopters and airplanes, and they go up there as fast as they can, because now Roger has given away his position. They have locked on his position with radio direction finders, and now the clock is ticking. They fly up there, and they hit all that anti-aircraft suppression fire around the perimeter of Hanoi, and they have to abort their mission and go home empty-handed without their search target. Roger now is on that canopy floor, and he is highly worried. The men go back to the base, and the word gets up to General Vogt, who is the 3-star in charge of all air operations for the war in that theater. And he does something that nobody had ever done before. He stops the war to go after Roger. Instead of having bombing missions the next day or any other support missions, he devotes every aircraft at his disposal to picking up and finding Roger Locker. And they fly in there with 119 aircraft. And they overcome that barrier of those people who wanted to stop them from getting their target. And they drop a Jolly Green Giant Air Force helicopter through that canopy, and they extract Roger, and they deliver him back to the base, and General Vogt flies down to meet him personally after this massive effort. When Roger went to the officers' club that evening at 1800, the entire base was there. Standing room only. And when he walked into that room, they stood up and applauded for 20 solid minutes. I want you to imagine the applause that we get from the angels in heaven when we find one lost sheep and bring them to Christ. That is our mission. They threw everything they had at it. And they succeeded. I teach a course at the National SAR School, Natural Search and Rescue School in Yorktown, Virginia, called Extreme SAR. And I'm asked to go in there because every year they prepare the ingoing commanding officers who are going into their first commands, the decision makers who are going to be doing the search and rescue missions over the next few years. They bring in old graybeards like me to talk to them about those outlying cases, those cases where, as a commanding officer, you're faced with half the information you need, but decisions that have to be made right now. And you know that you are walking a fine line between getting a medal and getting fired, and you don't know what side of that line you're on. But you've been put into the position. We walk through those, and one of the cases that I use by example that I oversaw was a case involving a fishing vessel called the Manly Ness. But the vessel name doesn't matter because the real thing that matters is the one human being named Jake Stahl, who was a Coast Guard rescue swimmer, 36 years old. And of all the rescue swimmers that worked underneath me, Jake was the one that if Central Casting called down and said, send me somebody to play the master rescue swimmer in the movie The Guardian, it would have been Jake Stahl. As luck would have it, Jake was on duty on a cold January night in 2012 at Air Station Atlantic City, New Jersey, when a distress alarm went off and there was a fishing vessel that had been run over by an inbound cargo carrier and it had capsized. And we were sorting everything we could, Coast Guard boats from the local station, and Jake and his crew got on an H-65 helicopter and they flew out there. And when they arrived on scene in the black of night, they looked down and there's this overturned vessel and a Coast Guard ship on one side and a Coast Guard and the guy's brother in an adjacent fishing boat on the other side. And it is a hot mess underneath a helicopter over the ocean at nighttime. It's like being in a miniature hurricane. There's noise and there's wind and there's sea foam blowing. And Jake jumps out of that helicopter and he goes over and he gets on the bottom of that overturned vessel and he hears a man screaming for bloody murder, for his life. He is trapped in the forward part of that hull and he can't get out. He's in an air pocket that we don't know how long is going to last. And the clock is ticking because one of two things is getting ready to happen. That vessel is going to lose that air pocket and he is going to rocket to the bottom of the ocean, or hypothermia is about to suck the last lifeblood out of him. Minutes are ticking and Jake knows at that particular point that there is nobody else on this planet capable of saving that man but me. The problem was Jake had two major obstacles he had to overcome. One obstacle was he had no scuba gear. He had to dive underneath a boat, a big boat, in the blackness of night without air and swim up through it, through two compartments to find his search target without light. Fact number two, there's a policy that absolutely prohibited him from going underneath that boat, because he was not a trained scuba diver. He was a rescue swimmer. The sister boat, the guy's brother who was on scene watching this, they're screaming bloody murder at Jake. Get under there, save my brother. The guys on the Coast Guard boat are going, Jake, you can't do it. The rules prohibit you from doing it. Don't do it, you'll die. Jake radios up to the aircraft commander who's in charge of this operation, who also knows that this is prohibited. And Jake asked for, send me down 2 Heeds bottles. These are 2 little small canisters with 2 to 3 minutes of air in them that pilots use to get out of overturned aircraft should they ever crash at sea. The pilot knew that if he sent those bottles down, he was given tacit approval to break the rules. And that if anything happened to Jake, his career was over. Not to mention Jake being dead. But he knew that Jake was going to do it anyway. And he knew, because this man had signed up to do exactly what he was doing at a time such as this, that he had a better chance of surviving with those bottles without him. And when he did that, he put his career squarely on the line. Jake took those 2 bottles and he dove underneath that boat, one underneath an armpit, one holding in the hand, and he's working his way. He's crawling through that blackness, lit only by the night sun underneath that whirling hurricane. And he works his way down into the cabin down there where the galley was, and there's floating seat cushions and lines and coffee cups and all the stuff you can imagine that would be floating around in an overturned vessel of that size. And he works his way up there and he thinks he's going into the compartment where the master is, who's trapped in there, and he gets hung up on a door jamb. As he tries to free his dry suit from the door jamb, he drops one of the bottles. He turns around and he has to work his way out of there with one hand holding this other thing. He gets to the surface, he vomits a quart of seawater, and he regains his composure as he's being yelled at by the guys on the 2 boats. Do it! Don't do it! Do it! Don't do it! Meanwhile, inside is a man dying. Jake takes that last bottle, puts it under his arm, puts it regular in his mouth. He's got 2 minutes to get through there, and he goes back in. He swims up through there. He swims through that blackness. He works his way through there. He doesn't get hung up. He walks. He gets his arm inside that dark black forward berthing compartment, and he feels an arm in that darkness. And he pulls that arm, and he pulls him out of there. And he told me later, he says, "Sir, I knew he was already dead. I just knew it, but I had to come out with him." I went in there because I knew I couldn't live with myself the rest of my life if I didn't try. But if I didn't come out of there with him for his family, they couldn't live with us. So as he's swimming out of there, he gets hung up again. He's snagged on some other obstruction, and he's got a choice: drop the air bottle or drop the dead man. He drops the bottle, swims out of there just in the nick of time to get a lung full of air before he drowned himself. The moral of that story is we don't always win. We don't always save the search target. But all Jesus wants us to do is try. All those men on that boat, his brothers, wanted him to do was try. Jake gave it all he had. In the aftermath, I wanted to reward Jake because it was the most heroic thing any one of my men had ever done. But headquarters said, no, if we reward him, we will be sending a message to all the rest of the fleet that it's okay to break the rules. And so Jake never got a medal. 5 years passed, and all those people at headquarters that had said no retired. And now I'm the 3-star Admiral, Atlantic Area Commander. On the 5-year anniversary of that heroic rescue, I had Jake flown down to Rescue Survival School, where he had trained as a seaman, and surprised him there, and we pinned an air medal on that man and recognized him finally for the success and the heroism that he performed on that cold January night. Now, so that's a great story, but what does it apply? How does it apply to you? We're churchgoers. We're not in the Coast Guard or the Navy. We're in the army of God. What's the message here? Well, what Jesus put on my heart as I was preparing for this particular series here is this. This is what Jesus is trying to tell us. He says, look, guys, you guys in the big churches, I know and appreciate what you're doing with your mission work. I know you are donating money and sending missionaries to places like Haiti and Africa and Bangladesh to spread the gospel. Keep doing it. But let's not forget, I need you first and foremost to focus on those who are in plain sight, right in your neighborhood, in the third cubicle down from you, in your office place. Those people you were walking by every day, good people, but lost people. Search them, find them. Most of them you don't even have to search for. You know exactly where they are. Gear up. Get ready to cross the bar because I'm sending some storms their way. You use those storms to your advantage to get to them with the gospel as they're enduring that storm. I had a coach in high school who had a phrase that I've never forgotten. Every once in a while, he'd stop a game. In the middle of the game, the whistle be blowing. He'd run out on the field as there's a timeout, and he'd grab some halfback by the face mask, and he'd be yelling at him with spittle coming out of his mouth. He said, look, when you see a hole, run through it. The linemen are opening up all these opportunities, and you're running right down the line of scrimmage and getting tackled and losing yardage. Head upfield. When you see a crisis occurring around you, there's a hole in the line. Use that crisis to your advantage. Use that crisis as the opportunity to open up the gospel of Jesus Christ to your friends. And be warned, you could get tackled. There are people out there just waiting for people like you and me, people in our army, those on the other side, to take us to task, to drag us right down because we go and we mention something like God, or Lord forbid, Jesus in the workplace or in the schoolhouse. Gird your loins. Gear up. Get ready to cross those bars and take advantage. Those watchdogs are out there, but I'm here to tell you, all those liberal watchdog groups, they don't come anywhere close to having the size of army that the Church of Jesus Christ does. And the problem with it is, we, the church, writ large, have constituted, we're such good people, we're such quiet, passive people. We constitute the silent majority, while that highly vocal minority of naysayers become the tail that wags the big dog, and we let them do it. We let them do it. And we are going to lose that war of our liberty, and our religious freedom will slowly but surely be sucked away from us if we don't stand up. Now, this sometimes will put us into that precarious predicament that we all hate so much. That time when we find ourselves caught between those 2 3-letter words that we all love so much, God and job. And if you choose the former and you get it wrong, you could lose the latter. And so if you go silent in a situation like that, what you have just done is made job your idol. What's the first commandment say? One of my favorite quotes from the great philosopher John Wayne is one on courage. He said, courage is being scared to death, but saddling up anyway. Sometimes we got to saddle up. One day, after I'd been promoted to a 1-star, they gathered a whole bunch of us newly minted 1-stars, generals and admirals from all the services, and we're going through this executive development course. And we're getting a joint briefing by a 2-star major general from the Air Force at the Pentagon, and he's finished up his brief. And he looks at us and he says, guys, it's the last class of the day. We're all getting ready to get on the bus and go back to the hotel, get ready for the next day. And so the guy had finished his briefing up, and he looks at us up. He says, guys, he says, I want to share something with you. He said, I'm retiring next Friday. He says, I was sitting over there where you are 5 years ago. He says, there's one thing that nobody ever told me that I wish they'd have told me when I was going through Capstone. I want to share it with you. He says, thing number one, he says, you got to be absolutely apolitical in everything you do. Well, we looked at each other. I get it. We didn't get to where we are by, talking politics. We knew better than that. But then he said something that rocked me back in my seat. He looks at it and says, and you guys check your religion in at the door. Well, that rocked me back in my seat. It didn't seem to faze anybody else. And he said, that was it. He was finished. Everybody's starting to pack up, ready to get on the bus. And I wanted to shoot my hand up in the air so bad and say, General, could you please tell me, what did you mean by that? Why did you say that? What happened to you? But I was too afraid. I didn't want to be that guy that held the class up. There's always one. So the question got left unasked and unanswered. Well, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because that general, I guarantee you, fell into one of two categories. He was either a man of faith who had gotten crossways and persecuted for expressing that faith in the workplace and perhaps had to leave early as a result of it. Or B, he was one of those who were trying to suppress those who expressed their faith in the workplace. What really mattered was the fact that the seeds of fear were now planted in every single one of us new generals and admirals who are now going to be leading the military forces for the next 7 to 9 years. Up to that point, I'd been practicing my faith subtly. I had a Bible on my desk. I said prayers in the wardroom, blessed the food before we ate. I named my boat Laus Deo. I was pushing my faith out there. I didn't beat anybody over the head with it, but if somebody came into my office and they had a storm going, I would ultimately end up leading down somewhere in this book, like the book of Romans, chapter 8:28, and we'd have a conversation. It was a tool of leadership. And now these watchdog groups are trying, and people at the Pentagon themselves trying to tell us, you can't do that anymore. Let's stay politically correct. The irony of all of that stuff is this. We all took an oath when we signed, we raised our hand in the armed forces to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. So help me God. I'm asking God to help me to support the Constitution. The First Amendment thereto says, Congress shall enact no law respecting the establishment of a religion, nor prohibiting the free practice thereof. It is a balanced equation, but the watchdog groups, they'll get out there and they're just going to hang on the first part of that equation, which establishment. Oh, talk God, you're establishing God into the public square. No. I'm just practicing my God-given right under the Constitution to express my faith. That's the dilemma that men and women in the armed services were in a number of years ago when I was on active duty. In the fall of 2012, I got sent to the last leadership training and development course that the United States Military Armed Forces has for anybody. The only people that get to go to this program called Pinnacle are 3 stars, or those that are about to be promoted to 3-star. So I show up at this, and now instead of 48 1-stars, I'm in a room with a very small select group of 7 or 8 people. And these are the people who the next 4 stars will be picked from that are going to lead our services. And there's a litany of people that come in there and they talk to us. I mean, people like the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Newt Gingrich, the Secretary of Homeland Security, Secretary of Defense. We have frank, heart-to-heart conversations. But there was one retired lieutenant general named Douglas Lute who came in to talk to us about that dance that military leaders have to do with their senior elected officials. People appointed over us to oversee the armed forces. People like the commander-in-chief, the secretaries of our services. And we talked about a litany of people who had gotten crossways with the commander-in-chief and gotten themselves fired through the years, like Douglas MacArthur and Stan McChrystal. Good men, but who got crossways. And he left us with this. He says, you guys need to be thinking about that issue or that principle for which you might be willing to throw your stars on the table for, because that day may come. Well, we didn't think much about it, but little did I know that within 6 short months, I would be placed in that very exact predicament. That young woman up there is my dear daughter-in-law, Kirsten. She came into my life. She married my youngest son just a few months before I retired from active duty. And so she saw all of that hoopla that is surrounded, that 3 stars are surrounded by. And she was just mesmerized by it. And so one day we're sitting out on the back porch and she asked me a question. She says, Papa, what was the scariest thing you ever did? Now she's thinking I'm going to come up with some sea story about some heroic and dramatic rescue at sea, or some law enforcement accident or incident where we arrested some drug runners down in the Caribbean. She was expecting something big, and I said, honey, let me tell you a story. Scariest thing that ever happened to me was looking into a little red light. Then I went on to explain to her how I had gotten asked to represent the military, all 5 of the military services at the 2013 National Day of Prayer. It's an honor. You don't apply for it. Somebody nominates you. You get selected, and you just get a cold surprise call. And when this foundation, headed by Dr. James and Shirley Dobson, called me up and asked me if I would be the military representative, knowing that anytime you step into that arena in uniform to talk about God, you're going into shoal water, I didn't want to do it. But I'm being asked to go represent my God, my faith. And if I'm really a man of God and I'm in God's army, how can I deny that and hide it under a basket? So I very reluctantly agreed, said, yes, I'll do it. But I tell you, I didn't want to, and I was nervous. So I explained to her how I went there on that day with a 10-minute prepared speech, because that's all they gave us was 10 minutes. And how I was the 7th or 8th guy in the batting order in a group of 7 or 8 to speak. And I was the last guy before the keynote speaker. That year it was Pastor Greg Laurie. And they had made it very clear that Pastor Laurie had to go on precisely at 11:40 a.m. And that each one of us previous warm-up speakers had exactly 10 minutes to deliver our remarks. And they gave us little business cards that says, with our name on it, and it said Admiral Lee, 11:24 to 11:34. Notice the specificity of that. And don't you dare go over. You can go under. Well, being the last in the batting order before the keynote, and he has to start it precisely on the mark, I'm starting to look the clock, and it's ticking. And we're past my start time, and I'm thinking, how's this going to work? Here comes a moderator down to me as Dr. Dobson is standing up there, getting ready to introduce the next day. He says, sir, I'm sorry, we're going to have to flip-flop you and Pastor Laurie. And I looked up at him with very grateful eyes, because I thought what he was telling me is that you're off the hook. We're passing you over. We've got to go straight to the keynote. It's almost 11:45. And I read back and said, thank you, Lord. I came. I was obedient. I appreciate that. I crossed my legs. I set my vanilla prepared speech down in the chair in front of me, and I listened to Pastor Laurie talk. And everybody's finished, and they stood up. Everybody's ready to go, 3 hours straight with no breaks, and I was ready to go with him, and then he starts to introduce me. My mind is in neutral. I'm not ready to speak. I didn't expect to speak, and I knew if I get up there and read them this 10-minute speech, they're going to hate me. I'll hate me. You can't do that. So the panic it reaches a crescendo, and he's reading my bio, and I'm going to be up on stage in 60 seconds. And then all of a sudden, the next thing that occurred is the most spiritual thing that has ever occurred to me. It was like somebody poured a warm pitcher of water right over my head, and it washed away all that fear, that barrier of fear. And it was like the Lord whispering, get on up there. Speak from the heart. I got you back. So I walked up on that stage, and I turned and I faced that sea of cameras and all them congressmen and them senators and all them high and famous people in that audience, live TV. And I turned and I faced them with not a clue what was about to come out of my mouth, but what I intended to be, whatever came out, I intended for it to be 2 to 3 minutes long, not a minute more. And I took a deep breath and I said, Lord, give me something. And you can watch this on YouTube tonight if you go just get into YouTube and call it up. You'll see that pregnant pause. I go, and then the Lord fed me. 14 minutes, 25 seconds later, I stepped off that stage. Absolutely certain I was going to be fired the next morning. But I had laid down against that oppression, that encroachment on our religious liberty, knowing I had just proverbially sacrificed my stars and my future career, and I loved my job. I walked off that stage, and my wife and I went to lunch, and we started getting giddy like two teenagers could be. We've been looking forward to retiring for a while, and I knew it was coming. So the next day, or that afternoon before the sunset, people were starting to call. Fox News wanted to interview me. The public affairs people at headquarters, they were calling me, begging me, don't do any interviews. Please don't do any interviews. I said, don't worry, I'm not saying nothing to any of them, but I stand on what I said, whatever it was. Jerry Boykin, Lieutenant General Boykin, called me up the first time I'd ever heard his voice, and he says, Dean, I heard what you did. I just want you to know we got you back. I needed that. I needed that affirmation, but I was ready to be fired the next day. So the next morning I go in I wake up and log on to the internet, and the first thing I see is this headline coming across. And my inbox, my email is starting to fill up. And when you read something that looks like that right there, and you're on active duty in the United States military, this does not bode well for your future career. So I head to the office, knowing this is likely to be it. And every morning, all the admirals and generals go into the situation room, and we get a briefing from a lieutenant on everything that's happened worldwide, Coast Guard, for the last 24 hours and what we think is going to happen the next 24 hours. And then we all break up, and we go off to our respective offices and start doing all that urgent but unimportant stuff admirals and generals do. Meetings after meetings after meetings. But on this particular morning, there's an 8,000-pound elephant over in the corner. It's Dean Lee. All my buddies, all my other admirals are in there, and then the commandant's in there, the 1 4-star we have. And as we start to break up, all my buddies, all them other 1-stars, they come over and, like, what up with that speech, Dean? What were you thinking, kind of thing. And then the commandant locks eyes on me, and he starts walking towards me, and they see him coming, and they part like the Red Sea. And he walks over there to me, and this is one of the greatest acts of leadership that I have ever witnessed in my life. Admiral Bob Papp's a man of faith himself, and he knew full well it happened. He had already listened to the speech. He had already seen the headlines. And he walks up to me and he reaches his hand out, just me and him now. All these other guys are over there watching, but they're kind of out of earshot. He sticks his hand out and he shakes my hand. He says, how you doing, Dean? And I look at him and I go, I'm doing well, Admiral. How you doing? He looks at me and gives me a little wink. He says, I'm doing fine. You have a good day. And he turns and he walks out. And that is the last I ever heard of it. Admiral Papp was in the army of God. He wasn't just a Coast Guardsman. He knew what I did was wrong in the world of political correctness, but right as a man of faith. And what he did with that little eye blink was send me a signal, much like we would do to our son when we come home and we see him sitting at the kitchen table with mom's arms folded over him, mad as a hornet because Johnny has been kicked out of school for a day for taking on the school bully. And you look at Johnny and you know you got to tell him, Johnny, you know I told you not to fight. But subliminally, you look at him and you wink and you go, I'm proud of you, son. One day, you may be in that position. One day, you may be in the position to defend somebody who took that risk. Will you do it? So I leave you with this as we go way over. When those winds of religious suppression start blowing your way, and they're not right now, they're calm, but they are going to. I guarantee you when that wind starts to pick up, you don't look for a place to run, look for a place to stand. And as you're standing there taking on that heat, gear up and remember the never founds. God bless all of you. God bless America.